Hello, and welcome to Grand Final History. In this episode, we go back to 1952, the 56th season of the VFL, when clubs travelled across the country to promote the Australian Code of Football, with premiership matches in Brisbane, Sydney, Hobart, and regional centres. It was a bit wet, though. Geelong was shocked when Bob Davis headed to Adelaide, getting a new job and a new home. Would they see him again as they attempted their back-to-back premiership run? For now, let's have a look at what was going on in 1952. The stories and articles getting the attention of players and supporters, after they'd got through the sports section of their newspaper, of course. Then we'll have a look at the pre-season news, how the season unfolded, and the 1952 final series. There was a huge outpouring of public grief at the death of King George VI in February. While he had been ill for some time, the announcement at 9 p.m, February 7th, was a shock. Some cinemas ended their screenings. Radio stations cancelled normal programming and played sacred music. Tram conductors and taxi drivers spread the news through the rest of the night. It was seen as a time for solemn mourning. Australians felt a very deep and strong connection to the royal family in a way that's hard to imagine today. They were a key part of Australia's identity as a member of the British Empire, rather than just filler for gossip magazines. The sadness was also matched with excitement about a young Elizabeth becoming Queen. Elizabeth and Philip had planned a trip to Australia as part of a tour of Commonwealth nations in 1952, but this was cancelled when she had to return to Britain upon the death of her father. In another side of being part of the British Empire, Australia became the site of a British atomic bomb test a week after the grand final, on the 3rd of October. The nuclear explosion was on Montebello Island, just off the coast of Western Australia. Britain became the third country after the United States and Russia to successfully detonate an atomic bomb. Australia became the fourth country to host a nuclear explosion. There would be more atomic bomb tests in Australia in the coming years. 1952 was an Olympic year, and the Games were in Helsinki from round 13 to round 15. St Kilda's full forward Peter Bennett had taken the season off to represent Australia in water polo. He was the third VFL player to compete at the Olympics. More will follow. It was an important Olympics for Australia, as Melbourne was scheduled to hold the next Games, if they could decide on a stadium. 85 athletes attended from Australia, winning 11 medals, 6 of them gold. The stars in the Australian team were the Lithgow Flash, Marjorie Jackson, who won gold in both the 100 and 200 metre sprints, and Shirley Strickland with gold in the 80-metre hurdles. Shirley also had a St Kilda connection. Her dad played one game for the Saints in 1900. He was also a very handy runner, winning the 1900 Stawell Gift. The other gold medalists were John Davies in the 200-metre breaststroke and cyclist Russell Mockbridge in the 1,000-metre time trial and the 2,000-metre tandem with Lionel Cox. Tandem bike races at the Olympics. Will they ever bring it back? Australian competitors had been advised to stick to plain food in the Olympic canteen. Steaks, veal, chops, potatoes and boiled vegetables were the instructions. Once their events were over, they could try the more exotic fare on offer. Bengal curries, Vienna schnitzels, Spanish paella, and Italian minestrone were tempting, but they would have to wait. We do live in different times to 1952. On the home front, the big Olympic news came in March, when, after 30 months of arguments, debates, and disputes, it was announced that Princes Park would be the 1956 Melbourne Olympic venue. There would be a 70,000 capacity stadium, which was later updated to 125,000, with the federal government paying half and the Victorian government and Melbourne City Council splitting the rest. There was even serious talk of the VFL investing in the stadium and it being expanded after the Olympics, with league head office moving in and the finals would be held there. The MCG trustees had ruled out the MCG, saying that preparations and levelling the ground would mean losing 2 seasons of cricket and 1 season of football. Carlton would have to spend 4 years of the redevelopment playing at Coburg. Carlton's president, Kenneth Luke, had been a powerful advocate of the Princes Park option, and he became vice chairman of the organising committee and attended the Helsinki Games. It would have created a marvellous home ground for Carlton, but let's just watch this space. In other Australian news, a man called Lang Hancock discovered the world's largest iron ore deposit in the Pilbara region of Western Australia. That just might have some ongoing impact in the years and decades to come. In more sporting news, John Landy had an athletics meeting at Olympic Park in December 1952. The previous evening, Landy had been at a reunion of Helsinki Olympians and had had a few beers. The next morning, he woke late, and, rushing to get to work at the title's office, he missed his breakfast. At lunchtime, as Landy made his way to Olympic Park, Ernest Hillier's chocolate shop proved irresistible to the now famished runner. He said, "I thought I've got to have one, so I had a chocolate sundae. But that wasn't enough, so I had 2 meat pies." His previous best time for the mile was 4 minutes and 9 seconds. With that unique preparation, on a rain-affected cinder track, with barely anyone watching, he did not expect too much. Yet, he blitzed the field. Without any paces, he ran 4 minutes and 2 seconds, the second fastest mile time ever. The 4-minute mile barrier was very close to being broken. December also meant a state election in Victoria, with John Cain Sr. leading the Labor Party to a rare election victory. That just might be important in the following year. And in news from around the world, the Korean War continued, with peace talks interrupted by more fighting. Meanwhile, the post-World War II occupation of Japan officially ended, although the US would continue to maintain large military bases. Dwight Eisenhower was elected President of the United States. Meanwhile, sports in the United States were grappling with the impact of television, which was causing a drop in attendance for baseball, football, and boxing. Payment for broadcast rights was still a bit ad hoc, with deals being done on a team-by-team basis rather than with the relevant league. The Los Angeles Baseball Club, for example, refused to share any of its TV revenue with visiting teams. It's not yet an issue for the VFL, but something they had to plan for. And 1952 also saw a new toy introduced to the world. Mr. Potato Head was launched in the US with the very first TV ad specifically aimed at children rather than adults. There might be a bit more of that sort of thing going on. While the first version of the toy did come with a styrofoam head, the instructions did say that a real potato or other vegetable could be used instead. Let's get back to the footy now. In January, Richmond supporters were surprised to hear that club legend Jack Dyer was stepping down as coach. The plan was that Jim Dean would come over from South Australia and become captain coach. Dyer had taken over a milk bar in South Melbourne, and this was needing his full attention. He also made the accurate prediction that coaching was fast becoming a full-time job, and they would soon be working for clubs 12 months a year. Well, that was still 2 or 3 decades away, but it would happen. However, Jim Dean would not get his clearance from South Adelaide for another couple of years, so Jack was still in charge of the Tigers for 1952. Many Essendon supporters were taking a closer look at the Stillwell gift than normal this year. Both popular defender Norm MacDonald and a member of the 1951 Grand Final team, Lance Mann, were competing. While many of his teammates put their money on MacDonald, Mann was the unbackable favourite. Mann came first, MacDonald second. The bookies had to pay out plenty, but any Essendon player who only bet on Norm had done their money. It was a good pre-season for Mann on the pro running circuit, which was very popular in that era. He became the first ever winner of the Wangaratta gift, Stillwell gift and Bendigo gift in the same year. Every year, especially in the lead up to a new season, there would be disputes between players and clubs when it came to getting a transfer, whether from a league club to a country or interstate club, or for country and interstate players looking to come to Melbourne on the promise of work and a place at a VFL team. The system was basically feudal, with players bonded to their clubs with no freedom of movement. If a club would not clear a player, there was nothing he could do except stand out of the game for 3 years. While it did provide clubs with some protection from players demanding ever higher wages, it left the players completely at the mercy of club committees that might refuse a clearance for the good of the club, or vindictive jealousy, or any reason in between. So far, nobody had tested this system in court, but there had been several proposals for an appeals board. This year, it was Melbourne's 1926 premiership captain, coach, and now president, who put forward a proposal suggesting that if a player had reached 100 games or 6 years of service, they would be free to transfer. Popular with the players, it got no traction with the delegates. Players would continue to be bonded to clubs for many years to come. The Bobby Davis saga was just one example of the power of a club over the individual player. The fastest man in football had just got married, was 23, and appointed playing coach of South Adelaide on £20 a week plus a new job. A far more lucrative option than the Coulter Law limit of £5 per week and £4 into the Provident Fund for his retirement. He went to Adelaide with his wife, moved into a new home, started a new job, but of course, Geelong refused to clear him. By March, he was suggesting that he would fly over each week to play for Geelong if he was given a clearance the following year. He said, "My career comes before football." The season started and Bobby remained in Adelaide, reporting on SANFL games for the Adelaide newspapers. The standoff eventually ended at the end of May, when the clearance window shut. He agreed to play for Geelong, and the club said that his request for a clearance in 1953 would be given reasonable consideration. He flew back for the Round 6 and Round 7 games and then moved to Ballarat. In the end, Bobby stayed with Geelong, became a captain, then a premiership coach, named in the Geelong Team of the Century, an Australian Football Hall of Fame inductee, and a legendary media performer, unforgettable on World of Sport and league teams. VFL and sports media history could have been very different if he went to Adelaide, but it was the clubs that had all the power in this era. There were 4 new coaches this season. One change was business as usual. One was through tragedy. The third was full of drama. And the fourth was a result of the third. Changing coaches at the start of a new season was business as usual at St Kilda. Comparing two ends of the spectrum, in the 30 seasons before 1952, Collingwood had 2 coaches and won 6 premierships. St Kilda had changed coaches 20 times for no premierships. The Saints advertised the role in late 1951, and the incumbent coach, Fred Green, did not reapply. The successful candidate was Cole Williamson, a former St Kilda player who'd taken Brighton to a premiership in the VFA as a playing coach. At 37, his playing days were behind him, and he knew what he was walking into when he said, "One big fault at St Kilda is that there has been too much interference with the many coaches by various committees. I saw the interference in the 10 years I was a player under Dan Minogue, Ansel Clark, Reg Garvin, Alan Hurd, Jack Knight and Huey Thomas." Williamson was aiming for a premiership, but at least he knew what he was going to be dealing with. St Kilda also made a small admission in their AGM that the club had been bankrupt 5 years earlier, but now everything was financially sound. Saints supporters would be confident that their club would never have any financial challenges again. Hawthorn's coach, Bob McCaskill, was ill from the start of the year and went into hospital in February. Hawthorn appointed their assistant coach, Jack Hale, as acting coach. Hale had played with Carlton and had one season as coach of South Melbourne before moving to Hawthorn as assistant coach in 1950. Interviewed before the start of the season, Hale said, "Any success I may have will reflect back on Bob McCaskill, He laid the foundations last year when Hawthorn won matches and looked like rising farther on the ladder. Sadly, McCaskill died at home in June, aged just 56. Hawthorn published a tribute from his home club Sandhurst in their annual report. It said, "He taught our youth the fundamental requirements of real manhood: courage, self-reliance, determination, and tolerance." Jack Hale would continue McCaskill's work and make his own mark on Hawthorn. As he later said, "When I went to Hawthorn, I took the Carlton spirit with me. I wanted to create a Hawthorn spirit by encouraging the local kids to become involved. I suppose it was the start of the family club tradition." And, to quote John Kennedy, Jack Hale taught Hawthorn to hate defeat. North Melbourne and Hawthorn honoured McCaskill with a trophy for games between the two clubs, first awarded in 1952. Sadly, it seems to have been forgotten after 1956. Now, the drama-filled change of coaches was at Melbourne. They'd had a terrible 1951 season under Alan LaFontaine, winning just one game. Yet, LaFontaine clearly had a plan. He'd cleared out the old wood. Many who'd been in that 1948 premiership team were gone, and Melbourne played 19 debutants in 1951. Yet, even during 1951, Melbourne's secretary, Jim Cardwell, spoke with Norm Smith to ask if he was interested in coaching the Demons. Smith refused to engage with Cardwell, saying his priority was coaching Fitzroy. But he did not say no. At the end of the season, Cardwell again approached Smith, and this time he agreed to apply for the job. Melbourne was his emotional home. The facilities were much better than at the Brunswick Street Oval, and the committee politics were a bit more predictable. LaFontaine had his supporters, and not everyone on the Melbourne committee was convinced that the stubborn, headstrong Smith was the man for the job. It was just a two-horse race, the same candidates as in 1949, when LaFontaine had succeeded by one vote. This time, Smith succeeded by just one vote. Given the mighty legacy created at Melbourne by Norm Smith in the years to come, it's worth noting how close he was to not getting the job at all. Melbourne Premiership captain Noel McMahon identified LaFontaine's contribution in an interview years later with Mike Sheehan. He said, "LaFontaine took it over and cleaned everything out. He had 3 years and he set it all up. He was a very intelligent man, but not an inspiring man. He should be credited for what Norm Smith was able to do later." Fitzroy cleared Smith back to Melbourne without any issue, a return of the courtesy Melbourne offered 3 years earlier when they cleared Smith to Fitzroy as a player. The Maroons made the simple choice of selecting Brownlow medalist captain Alan Ruthven to become the captain coach. Norm Smith endorsed the decision. He should do well. Alan is a great sportsman and a gentleman. In addition, he knows the game. What's more important, he will have the confidence of his men, for after all, Alan is almost Fitzroy itself. The Fitzroy committee also decided they wanted a new emblem. They had experimented with the gorillas at one point, but already ruled this out way back in 1940, and in 1952 they reinforced that this was not an option. Nothing was decided, so it would still be the Maroons, or the Roys, or the Roy Boys. The lion would not appear until later in the decade. It's worth noting one notable debutant in 1952. In round 1, Alan Aylett played the first of 220 games in a career with many highlights that saw him selected in the North Melbourne Team of the Century. In round 1, he was a 17-year-old, and all his schoolmates from University High promised to be at the game. However, it was his future role as an administrator, first as president of North Melbourne and then president of the VFL, where he played a pivotal role in the modernisation of the league. For now, he was focused on his footy. Perhaps round 9 was the first time he would cross paths with Jack Hamilton, his future partner at league headquarters. Something for future episodes. 1952 was also the year a 16-year-old Ron Barassi came to live with Norm Smith. Ron's mum was getting remarried and moving to Tasmania. Ron did not get on with his new stepdad, and Melbourne were a little concerned that getting a clearance for Ron from Tasmania might be a challenge. He was already playing in the under-19s, and his potential was obvious to Smith. The father-son rule was in place, but that only applied to the metropolitan zones of Melbourne. So Norm arranged with Ron's mum to board Ron at his place, in a bungalow out the backyard. Ron also took up a job at the famed Miller's Rope Works in Brunswick, home to many Melbourne footballers, and he continued his study at night school. 1952 was going to be a 19-round season, one more than the usual 18, to allow for the ambitious National Day in round 8. The National Day was designed to promote the game, with interstate matches scheduled for the bye round when Western Australia would be playing Victoria at the MCG. Not all clubs were happy about travelling away from Melbourne. Collingwood threatened legal action, unhappy about depriving their supporters of any games, some of whom had not missed a match in 10 or 20 years. St Kilda also declared that the league should focus on improving the game in Victoria. Geelong was also opposed, but all the other clubs supported the move to grow the game. National Football Council Chair Ray Brew responded to Collingwood's criticism with some compelling logic. Club supporters would still get 18 rounds as normal. There was just an extra round that would be played while the interstate game was on at the MCG. He also noted that Collingwood had spent £3,000 travelling to Perth during the interstate bye round in 1951, but now they were opposed to promoting the game for the good of all. Despite the opposition of Collingwood, St Kilda and Geelong, and the threat of further legal action, the plan was approved at the delegates' meeting in February. The grand final replay between Essendon and Geelong would be in Brisbane, to be played at night in another first. Richmond would play Collingwood in Sydney, the Magpies returning to the SCG for a premiership match for the first time since 1903. Fitzroy would take on Melbourne in Hobart, and the other games were at a series of regional locations. South Melbourne and North would make it into New South Wales, just playing at Albury. Footscray would play St Kilda in Geelong, and Carlton and Hawthorn were scheduled for Euroa, a bit of a boon for country Victorian tourism too. The ongoing inflation surge, which was about 17% in 1952, saw the prices for footy go up again. Entry into the outer in 1950 cost just 1 shilling and 3 pence. In 1951, it was 2 shillings, and now, in 1952, it was 2 shillings and 6 pence. Cue outrage and expect more rises in the coming seasons. The 1952 season opened on Saturday, the 19th of April. The rain kept the total crowd at the 6 games to just 123,000, but the increased prices meant that it was a record gate-taking for the clubs. Most of the games were close, except for one. The match of the day was the replay of the 1951 first semi, when Footscray hosted Essendon. It was a low-scoring tussle, close all day, with the Bulldogs finishing 5 points in front. Melbourne, who'd finished the 1951 season last on the ladder with just one win, were at home to the premiers, Geelong. Demons supporters would have been excited at the change in their form, even if they missed out on the win, going down to the Cats by just 1 goal. The Lakeside pennant was at stake when St Kilda visited South Melbourne, with the Saints kicking themselves out of the game. 8 goals, 26 behinds to South Melbourne on 11-16. In the final quarter, the Saints kicked an excruciating 2 goals, 13 behinds, which meant that the Swans won by 8 points, with 7 less scoring shots. Fitzroy were at home to Richmond, with new coach Alan Ruthven in charge for the very first time. They were 3 goals down at the last break, yet did not allow Richmond to kick another goal in the last quarter. If only they'd been a bit more accurate. 1 goal 6 in that last quarter left them 8 points short of a win. North were in all sorts of trouble at three-quarter time in their game against Carlton. They'd only kicked 3 goals in 3 quarters of football, and were 7 goals behind the Blues. Then they delivered an almighty rush, kicking 5 goals, 2 behinds. It was a much better effort, but a bit too late, going down by 23 points. The one-sided game was at Victoria Park. The Hawks kicked just 2 goals all day. Years later, John Kennedy record Lou and Ron Richards' Lair Rising in the goal square, with Lou handballing it to Ron, saying, "You kick the goal," and Ron handballing back to Lou, saying he should kick it. John Kennedy just charged into the nearest one. The Magpies won easily by 86 points. For Kennedy, it was just one more reason why he would focus on lifting the Hawks. Empire Day was a traditional celebration of the British Empire dating from 1903. While never an official holiday, schools would have a half-day holiday and there were bonfires in the evening. 1952 was the first Empire Day with the new Queen Elizabeth II, and it fell on a Saturday. So the VFL took a break between round 5 and 6 and played another Lightning Premiership on the MCG. A couple of Lightning Premierships were run during the war to raise patriotic funds, and it was revived in 1951, when the money raised went to the Women's Hospital Appeal. This year, it was the Players' Provident Fund benefiting, building up the pool of money to be paid out to retiring players. It was a knockout competition with 2 10-minute halves. After more than 5 hours of footy frenzy, Melbourne beat South in the final by 7 points. Perhaps a small revenge for the round 5 loss to South, also played at the MCG. 33,719 people attended at the MCG, but that's about 90,000 less that attended the 6 games held on a normal Saturday. Round 6 saw an early example of movie marketing and VFL football when the Burt Lancaster adventure film 10 Tall Men was promoted by a competition to find the 10 tallest VFL players, who each received a kit bag. The tallest 1952 player was Essendon's Jeff Leake at 6 foot 4.5 inches, or 193 centimetres in the metric. As of 2026, the tallest ever AFL players is a tie between Ned Reeves, Mason Cox, Aaron Sandilands, and Peter Street, who all went onto the field at 211 centimetres, or 6 foot 11 in the old ways. Jeff Leake would hardly stand out in the modern game. By the end of May, the season was 1/3 complete, and Geelong and Collingwood were once again hosting the 2 top spots, both undefeated. The Magpies on top with an extraordinary percentage of 197.5. South Melbourne had been the surprise packet so far in 1952. They were third, with 5 wins, and looking to return to finals for the first time since that infamous 1945 bloodbath grand final. Essendon were holding on to 4th. Like 1951, they were starting the season slowly, but they still had 3 wins, followed by Melbourne, Carlton and Richmond, also on 3 wins. 8th on the ladder was Footscray, followed by Fitzroy and Hawthorn, all on 2 wins. North were 11th with just 1 win, and the Saints, who had a new coach, but they were in the familiar 12th spot, yet to get a win. Round 7 was the first ever Queen's Birthday split round, and it was the last chance to see the clubs in action before the controversial National Day the following week took the clubs away from the fans. Supporters flocked to the games. A record home and away crowd of 58,563 at the MCG saw the Demons beat the Magpies, the first loss for the season for Collingwood. More than 172,000 attended the 6 games across the Saturday and the Monday, the highest ever attendance for a round. Then, Round 8, Saturday the 14th of June, was unlike any other in the VFL's history. Only 1 game was played in Melbourne. Victoria versus Western Australia, where the home team beat a young Western Australian side by 9 points, in front of a healthy crowd of 40,790. In Hobart, the weather was dry, and the North Hobart ground was packed with 18,000 locals keen to see VFL football. Fitzroy led all day to beat Melbourne by 20 points. In Geelong, only 3,500 braved pouring rain on a day that struggled to get to 12 degrees to see St Kilda win their first game of the season, beating Footscray by 15 points on an ankle-deep bog of a ground. Perhaps none of the Bulldog players mourned the day that oval and the rest of Geelong was dug up for the ever-expanding brown coal open pit in the 1970s. At Euroa, 7,500 saw Carlton beat Hawthorn by 37 points. Across the border in Albury, on New South Wales territory, 15,000 people, including many new migrants from Bonegilla and Snowy River scheme workers from Mount Beauty, saw South Melbourne beat North on a somewhat boggy ground. The weather was very unkind in both Sydney and Brisbane. In Sydney, the aim had been for a crowd of about 50,000, but a very wet day meant that the centre of the SCG was underwater. But still, 24,174 people saw Collingwood beat Richmond by 32 points. It was a very healthy crowd on a challenging day for anyone to leave home. In Brisbane, the news was worse. The rainfall was so bad that the management of the exhibition grounds would not let the game be played, fearing damage to the oval. This set off an interesting chain of events, which we will discuss shortly. Richmond and Collingwood supporters had been able to follow their game on radio station 3DB, with Ron Casey and George Andrew describing the play. They had a heroic plan which modern-day commentators would not dare replicate, of rushing to Mascot Airport after the game, flying to Brisbane and broadcasting the second half of the Essendon-Geelong game. Obviously, those plans changed, and they ended up broadcasting the second half of the game from 9 p.m. Monday night. Pioneers of the interstate radio broadcast. So let's have a look at that game in Brisbane, where there was so much happening. It was the first in Brisbane and the first under lights for premiership points. Geelong were not keen on the National Day concept, and their mood was not improved when they saw that their fullback, Bruce Morrison, was selected for state duties. But John Coleman, mysteriously, was free to play for Essendon. Did the VFL want the most glamorous player in the competition headlining the game's push up north? Just getting to Brisbane was a bit of a challenge in these early days of air travel. Geelong players gathered at Cardinia Park at about 8 a.m. on Thursday, travelling by bus to Essendon Airport, where 50 players, officials and support staff boarded a TAA Skymaster. First stop, Canberra, then Sydney, then eventually arriving in Brisbane, where the players were spread around 5 different hotels. Friday was a day of excursions, including a trip to Surfers Paradise, then just a tiny coastal town. Some went to the pub, others to the beach, enjoying the novelty of wading in the ocean in June, and thankful they were not in Hobart or your lawn. Then the rain started, a downpour unlike anything seen in Victoria, soaking the players to the skin before they made it back to the shelter of the pub. They drove back to Brisbane through the rain. On Saturday, they had the option of going to the Rugby League International between Queensland and New Zealand, or the races at Albion Park. Geelong's wingman, Neil Trezise, spotted a Victorian trainer, Clive Marsh, at breakfast at the hotel, and he got a hot tip on a horse called Moritz. They worded up some of their teammates and collected a sizable kitty, then headed to the track. The local bookies saw some young, naive blokes from down south, and they gave them odds of 10 to 1. It was up against Lucky Ring, the best horse in Queensland. Despite a stunning late run by Lucky Ring, Moritz won by a head, and the boys collected handsomely. They headed back to the hotel, only to find the game was called off, as discussed, because the exhibition ground management feared damage to the ground. There was talk of calling it a draw, but the Queensland government had been a party to hosting a game in Brisbane, and they insisted a game be played. League officials did some fast work, and the game was rescheduled to Monday. Players had to let employers know that they would be missing, and the league had to come up with an extra £1,200 to cover wages and additional travel costs. That left a lot of young men in a strange town on a Saturday night with their pockets full of some unexpected winnings. While Essendon seemed to have their team under a tighter leash, quite a few of the Geelong players had a very enjoyable night out. Come Monday night, the Ekka was the centre of attention. When the Essendon bus pulled up, they had to call in extra police to escort John Coleman to the ground. The queues were backing up as the ground staff tried their best to get 28,000 people into the ground. When the game started, many were tired of waiting, and they pushed through an outer gate and stormed into the ground. Police were outnumbered and unable to stop the rush. It was a much bigger crowd than anyone expected on a Monday night. They wanted to see Coleman in action, and he did not disappoint. Geelong's Russell Henfrey had never played at fullback. He was told to stick with Coleman wherever he went. Pretty quickly, he was struggling. Coleman kicked 3 goals in the opening 5 minutes, and then his 4th shot went wide for a point. Russell Henfrey, remembering his instructions, stuck right next to Coleman as he moved 25 metres out for goal. John then turned to him and said, "Russell, you're supposed to kick the ball in." Henfrey jogged back to the goal square, picked up the ball, and completed the kick-in. It was a shellacking. The Geelong players had been on the booze. The short ground meant that their half-back line had no room to move. The ball could be fed into Coleman with ease, and he delighted the crowd, taking spectacular marks, kicking a club record of 13 goals. Essendon won by 69 points. It did not make up for the grand final loss the year before, but it felt good for the Bombers. Red Chicky was not happy. After the game, he gave his players a very direct message. "This is a disgrace to this great club. What's happened out there? You've let our club down, and what you've served up was no indication of what you can actually do." The players knew he was right, and it was the start of something special in Geelong, even if it took them until 7 p.m. Wednesday night to get back home. Back in Melbourne, the rain kept on falling, the grounds were soaked, mud was everywhere, and yet people still came to watch. In the round 9 game between Richmond and Carlton, a white ball was used, which was more waterproof and easier to see in the gloomy conditions. Most were in favour of the change, and they would be used in many of the weeks to come. Some of the clubs had to get new jumpers, as the constant wet weather for the games and training had shrunk the woolen tops to half their normal size. It was a tough season to be playing football. In round 10, Fitzroy hosted Essendon at the Brunswick Street Oval. Essendon had doubts about playing the game. It was not just the mud. The ground was a stinking quagmire. For the one and only time in his VFL career, John Coleman did not kick a goal. Just 2 shots for 2 behinds. Vic Chanter was playing fullback, and while the conditions may have helped, he did get a £10 bonus from one proud supporter. Vic said it was the most he ever got for playing a game of football. Essendon's Lance Mann recalled coming off the ground and going straight into the showers, clothes and all, to try and wash the mud off. Then tetanus injections from the medical staff. Peter Bye of the Sporting Globe investigated the Brunswick Street Oval after many complaints, with suggestions that it might be declared not up to league standard, forcing games to be transferred. The ground was a mud heap that stank. There was a pile of manure near the toilets, rubbish dumps, and a general air of insanitary conditions. As he was checking the ground out, he was joined by the cricket club ground manager, who was also the health inspector for the Fitzroy Council, who did not see any problems with the state of affairs. So maybe that was one of the problems. League football had become a big business by 1952, but the fact that most clubs did not control the grounds they played on was a perennial problem. There was a lot going on in round 11, 1952. Geelong and Essendon played at Windy Hill, with the Cats looking to redeem themselves after that loss in Brisbane. Essendon were well behind at three-quarter time, but managed to scamble a draw as the rivalry between the two clubs developed. There was drama at Arden Street when North were playing South Melbourne. Umpire Wright collapsed at half-time and was replaced by the emergency umpire, who did a capable job. However, as Alf Brown asked on the following Monday, who cast the Brownlow votes for the game? We'll never know, as the votes were not counted round by round. Anyway, it did not impact the count, and no North or South players were anywhere near the top of the list of votes. Meanwhile, at Glenferrie Oval, Carlton fullback Ollie Grieve was reported on the unusual charge of attempting to strike a spectator. He was cleared, telling the special tribunal that he had fallen into the fence and was just putting his arms up for balance. Collingwood hosted Richmond at Victoria Park, and it was intense. Richmond defender Mopsy Fraser and Bill Toomey were both reported after a heavy clash in the last quarter. Fraser was then attacked by a Collingwood supporter who ran onto the ground. He was escorted from the ground by police. A Richmond trainer was reported for striking the emergency umpire, and there were a number of brawls in the crowd during and after the game. Just another day at Victoria Park. Fraser and Toomey were both suspended for 4 weeks. The Richmond trainer, William McDonald, pleaded guilty and was banned at the league's pleasure, effectively a lifetime ban, ending 36 years of connection with league football across Essendon, Footscray, and the last 20 with Richmond. He regretted hitting the emergency umpire in a moment of excitement and apologised. McDonald also faced legal charges and, at a court hearing, avoided a criminal penalty by offering umpire Ray Manning a public apology and offering to pay any costs or damages. Manning withdrew the charges to end the case. Things were a bit more relaxed at the MCG, even though Fitzroy came from behind for the win. Norm Smith sent a trainer out to the Maroons' Jack Toohey to invite him and the other Fitzroy players to a drink after the game. Smith may have switched back to Melbourne, but he still wanted to catch up with his former teammates. After all that, round 12 meant that the season was 2/3 complete. Geelong were clear on top of the ladder, with 9 wins and a draw, followed by Collingwood on 9 wins, then Carlton on 8 wins and a draw. South Melbourne was still in the 4 on 8 wins, ahead of Fitzroy by percentage. South had lost to Essendon in round 12, which had made them vulnerable. 6th on the ladder was Melbourne, on 6 wins and that draw with Carlton in round 12. Essendon only had 5 wins and a draw. Although they had not been beaten by top-of-the-ladder Geelong, they may not be making finals on their current form. Richmond were 8th with 5 wins, followed by North and Hawthorn on 4 wins. Footscray were 11th with 3 wins, and St Kilda, with just 1 win, were once again last. The unrelenting heavy rain was causing challenges for all clubs. By mid-July, most were looking for alternative training grounds to provide some respite for the flooded and waterlogged surfaces. At Fitzroy's ground, a horse-drawn plough carved furrows to help drain hundreds of gallons of water. The reserves game, due to be played that week, was transferred to another ground. During round 13, the VFL sent a team to Adelaide and lost by 17 points. There was some frustration with the decision to select a state team while premiership matches were still on. A team selected with 2 men from each of the top 9 teams and 1 from the bottom 3 meant that it was not the best Victorian side, while also disrupting clubs as they competed for final spots. South Melbourne were giving their supporters plenty to be nervous about as finals approached. In their round 13 game against St Kilda, they trailed by 2 goals with 5 minutes to go. 2 quick shots meant scores were level when the siren went. Fortunately for the Swans, Bill Nolan took a glorious mark in the goal square with just seconds to go, and his kick after the siren gave them a 6-point win, leaving St Kilda with still just 1 win for the season. In round 14, South Melbourne took on Carlton. When the final siren went, the scores were once more level, but there were no after-siren heroes this time. A draw was better than a loss, but not enough to keep 4th spot, when Fitzroy managed a 1-point win against Collingwood. That game was also the last match in Gordon Hocking's career. The former Collingwood skipper had broken a leg a year earlier playing for Victoria. He'd managed 4 games this season without regaining his form, and at a club function that night he announced his surprise retirement. He was the last of the pre-war players, another sign of the changing generation. The heavy grounds and wet conditions led to lower scores and closer results. Round 15 saw Collingwood come from behind to beat Essendon by 1 point, and Carlton followed up their draw against South Melbourne with a 1-point loss to Fitzroy, which put them out of the 4 and South back in. South and Carlton were both competing for the 4th spot with only 3 games to go, but round 16 seemed to show that neither wanted to play finals. Carlton lost their 2nd game in a row by just 1 point, going down to 9th place Essendon, which could have given South a golden opportunity, except they lost by 3 goals to 11th placed Hawthorn, who now had 5 wins for the season. The Blues had been on an extraordinary run of close results. Over the last 5 weeks, they had 2 draws and lost 2 games by 1 point. They were sitting 5th with 9 wins and 2 draws, but it could have so easily been 13 wins and 2nd on the ladder. A very frustrating time for supporters and the club. So with 3 rounds to go, Geelong was well clear on top and Collingwood were second, a game clear of Fitzroy, who were just 2 points in front of South, who were just 2 points ahead of Carlton. 5 teams in the race with only 4 spots available. Then Carlton broke their run of near misses with a strong fourth quarter to beat Collingwood. Fitzroy and South both won their games, so now Fitzroy were even with Collingwood on points, but with a much worse percentage. If the Maroons could keep on winning and hope the Magpies lost a game, they might pinch second. In round 18, Carlton beat the Saints and Collingwood held on to second with a strong win over the Bulldogs. The match of the day was at the Brunswick Street Oval, with Fitzroy taking on South. It was a close match all day, but Fitzroy used their home swamp advantage to win by 7 points. Carlton went to 4th and South dropped to 5th. There was just one more round to go. The advantage was with South Melbourne. Carlton had to travel to Cardinia Park. Geelong had not lost a game since that eventful match in Brisbane in round 8. South were playing Footscray, who was second last on the ladder. All the Swans had to do to make the finals, assuming Geelong would beat Carlton, was beat the team second last on the ladder. But Footscray won by 30 points. It was an ugly way to end the season. Collingwood beat Melbourne to hold on to second spot. Not that it mattered. Fitzroy had only won 2 of their first 6 games. Their ground had literally been ploughed up to drain the muddy water that was turning it into a bog. But they had got themselves into finals after winning many of their games by less than a goal. So maybe they just relaxed in that last game of the season against 12th place St Kilda and lost by 1 goal. Kicking 8 goals and 18 behinds didn't help them either. The only interest in the Richmond-Essendon game in round 19 was John Coleman's attempt to get 100 goals. In 12 seasons since 1940, Essendon had only missed the finals once, in 1945. Since 1946, they had played in 7 grand finals, but round 19 was going to be their last game for 1952. Coleman gave Richmond hardman Mopsy Fraser a bath, quickly kicking the 6 goals he needed for a century, finishing the game with 9 to give him 103 for the season. His 3rd ton in 4 seasons of football, and he was sitting on 398 career goals. There was some disquiet by Richmond officials. Had Fraser allowed Coleman to get his ton? Had he been bribed? Or had the known gambler backed Coleman? Jack Dyer accompanied some committeemen and they asked him directly. Fraser denied the charge. Some days you just couldn't stop Coleman. What Fraser only revealed later was that he and Dyer had bet £50 that Coleman would not kick his ton. So Fraser had lost out in multiple ways. It was going to be the end of Don Fraser's colourful career. After the season was over, he was found to have gambled away the players' end-of-season trip money. Perhaps the players might have shared the blame for letting Fraser look after the funds. He was then heard criticising the Richmond Committee and given an open clearance. Mopsy had played 7 seasons for 124 games and was suspended for 16 games, or 13% of the total games he's played. He became captain coach of Port Melbourne in the VFA, winning the 1953 premiership, and also played for Paran in a total of 37 VFA games that also saw him suspended for 30 weeks. That Carlton game in Geelong drew a huge crowd of 49,107, which was 70% of Geelong's total population. Thousands more were turned away, and many who got into the ground left when they could not find a spot to watch. One enterprising woman wore stilts. Geelong won by 45 points, but when the Blues got the news that South had lost to Footscray, they knew they were in the finals. Geelong finished the season on top of the ladder with 16 wins and 1 draw and a very dominant performance since that spray from Coach Hickey after the game in Brisbane. Collingwood was second with 14 wins, followed by Fitzroy with 13 wins and Carlton making up the 4 with 11 wins and 2 draws. South Melbourne had been in the 4 for 15 weeks out of 19 rounds, no lower than 5th in the other 4 weeks, but 5th they were after round 19, collecting their 8th or mostest award for just finishing out of the finals. It was the start of a long drought for South Melbourne. They would not make the finals until 1970, when their coach will be Norm Smith, which is a tale for another episode. And in 1952, Norm Smith had taken Melbourne from 12th to 6th with 9 wins. His fierce approach to coaching and the foundations laid by Alan LaFontaine were beginning to pay off. North Melbourne was 7th with 9 wins, a bit of improvement on the 7 wins the year before, but a long way off the form that got them into the grand final only 2 seasons ago. 8th on the ladder was Essendon, with just 8 wins and a draw. They had broken their run of grand final appearances, and they would have to look at rebuilding. Richmond was 9th on the ladder, also on 8 wins, and there would be changes at Punt Road. Footscray were 10th, dropping away after making finals last year, but they were a young team and they had prospects. Hawthorn were in a familiar 11th spot, but they had won 5 games, which was 1 more than last year, and changes were happening. They still had much work to do, but they were moving in the right direction. St Kilda were once more wooden spooners. Just 2 wins meant work for new coach Cole Williamson. He would get another season, so let's see what happens. Brownlow medal votes were counted on the Wednesday night after the end of the home and away season. Richmond's ruckman, Roy Wright, won the vote when he tied with Essendon's Bill Hutchinson and was awarded the medal on the countback, as required at the time. As a kid, Wright suffered from rheumatic fever, and he had to wear splints for a year when he was 12. Each day his mother had to take him into the children's hospital. His doctor warned him off all competitive sports for 3 years. He finally began his football, first at North Kew, where the 15-year-old won the best and fairest in his first year. He was zoned to Richmond and they invited him to training. After a few games in the reserves, he was playing in the seniors, sharing ruck duty with Jack Dyer. 6 years on, he was the number 1 ruckman at the club. He was at home with his parents on the night of the Brownlow count, and he heard the radio news flash saying that he had won, and then he received a phone call from Richmond President Harry Dyke with the good news. The phone did not stop ringing, and friends and family came over to celebrate. Wright may have shared ruck duties with Jack Dyer and been coached by Captain Blood, but they were very different players. He was known as the Gentle Giant, a fair player who would help opponents up if they'd been knocked over. Years later, Wright explained his scrupulously fair style of play. I was classed as a ball player, and some people thought I should have used my weight more. I felt, however, that if I could not beat an opponent by trying to match with his skill, I did not want to beat him any other way. Because of Collingwood's Harry Collier calling out the VFL after they allowed Brownlows to be awarded in the case of a tie, there was a ceremony in 1989 to present medals to those who'd missed out in the countbacks after a tied vote. Sadly, Bill Hutchinson had died, but a very proud Dick Reynolds was able to drape the medal over the head of Bill's widow, Nell, who had supported him throughout his career. It was a fitting match with a Brownlow that he would win in 1953. That's for the next episode. For the second year in a row, the VFL offered supporters the option of booking reserve seats for all finals matches for £3. As in 1951, they were well and truly oversubscribed. Bookings opened and closed at the Allen's Music Store the Thursday before round 17. There were 2,000 applications for just 500 seats. Those who missed out would have to line up with everyone else. Many wanted more reserve seats to be offered, but the league's hands were tied. An Act of Parliament restricted where reserve seats could be offered. Times have changed, and reserve seats via online sales is the way we get our finals tickets now. But we're still not happy with the process. The first semi-final saw Carlton taking on Fitzroy. The Blues were favoured to win in a survey of league players and in many of the previews, even though Fitzroy had beaten them twice this season. 60,000 people were at the game, and after all the rain this season, they got a perfect spring day, many using newspapers to create hats to shield themselves from the unfamiliar sunshine. Fitzroy started the game well, seeming to have more confidence than Carlton, who did not help themselves with terrible kicking. The Blues did not kick a goal until 18 minutes into the second quarter, and at half-time they were trailing Fitzroy 6-3, 39, to Carlton's wasteful 3-10, 28. With Keith Warburton moving to the centre and George Ferry taking full forward spot, the Blues put on a strong third quarter, quickly kicking 3 goals, but then they wasted more shots. The three-quarter time break had Fitzroy on 8 goals 5, 53, to Carlton, 7 goals 17 behinds, 57. That last quarter was a tense, hard-fought affair. The Roys gained the lead and the backline was solid, with back pocket player Bill Stephen showing great judgment and anticipation to repel the Carlton attacks. The Blues managed to tie the scores with less than a minute to go, and some began planning for a replay. But Fitzroy captain coach Alan Ruthven grabbed the loose ball from a throw-in, snapped a shot, and scored the winning behind. The siren went moments later. Fitzroy had won 4 games this season by 1 point, 2 of them against Carlton. They were into the preliminary final. The semi-final was overshadowed by a near tragedy later that night. Carlton's Keith Warburton had copped an accidental elbow from Bill Stephen early in the game. He played out the match with just some dry retching. Later that night he was at the club dance, but he was passing blood in his urine. Then he collapsed. Rushed to hospital, he collapsed again and was operated on immediately. He had a ruptured bowel and a burst intestine. After having part of his bowel removed, he remained in a critical condition. Several teammates and umpires helped by donating blood, and the hospital switchboard was inundated with calls. On Monday, rumours spread like wildfire across Melbourne that he had died. But by the end of the week, Warburton was out of danger, and after an extended hospital stay, he recovered and he would play the following season, wearing a large leather belt around his middle to provide some support and protection. It had been a close shave, but the man they called the Acrobat made it to 90 years, living 1 year longer than Rose, his wife of 65 years, and who had done so much to nurse him through those perilous days. A reminder that there is many things more important than footy. The second semi-final between Geelong and Collingwood had to be played, but almost all football followers expected the Cats to win. Collingwood coach Fons Kine spoke for all Magpie supporters when he said they should prepare for the shock of the year. A record semi-final crowd of 77,417 were at the MCG to see if they could surprise them. The first half of the game was fairly even, but as expected, it was Geelong that took control in the second half, kicking 9 goals to Collingwood's 3 to win by 54 points. The Argus called it streamlined football, which sparkled like champagne compared to the flat soda water of the first semi-final. Hugh Buggy declared that Geelong only needs the emergency to draw out extra power, and at no time on Saturday did that emergency arise. The Cats were in the grand final, while the Magpies had to take on Fitzroy in the preliminary final. And if you bought the Argus on the Monday after the final, you would see colour photos of the game. In a brave move, the Argus was the first newspaper in the world to bring high-speed action photos in full colour. They'd been doing selected pages since July, and this week there would be colour photos of the footy on Monday and a special lift-out on Thursday for the Royal Show. The coloured photos looked great, and they were very popular. Yet, the new printing machines were a very expensive investment, and they were not always reliable. Some mornings the Argus would not be distributed until after 9 a.m, meaning many, many lost sales. High costs and falling circulation would lead to the closing down of the Argus in January 1957, and colour photos in daily papers would not return until the 1980s. But they were great while you could get them. 54,000 were at the preliminary final, and unlike the previous week, there was no clear-cut favourite. Collingwood played a faster, more direct style of play, with long kicking and high marking, compared to the Maroons' shorter passing style. The Magpies led all day, and it was the second quarter that set them up for victory, kicking 5 goals while holding Fitzroy to just 1 behind. Bob Rose played a superb game, which, as the Age noted, demoralised Fitzroy as much as it stimulated the Magpies. In just one 15-minute period in that second quarter, he kicked 3 goals 3 on his own, while setting up the other 2 goals. While Fitzroy did come back in the third term, they could not kick a goal in the last quarter. The Magpies getting a well-deserved victory and their first grand final appearance in 12 years. Looking back at the game, several Fitzroy players would pay tribute to Norm Smith, who, with no disrespect to Alan Ruthven, had laid the foundations of the success they were able to achieve that season. Jack Gaffney went as far as to say that if Smith had been coaching them, they might have made the grand final. Still, I reckon the Baron Ruthven deserves some credit getting his team to the preliminary final, given the conditions they had faced on the Brunswick Oval every second week and disrupting training. It had been a tough winter on all grounds, but from all the reports, it seems the Brunswick Street Oval suffered the most. Collingwood may have made it to the grand final, but, if anything, their odds were now looking worse. Such was the physical battering they had taken from Fitzroy, while the Geelong players were able to rest and watch from the grandstand. For the 1952 grand final, Geelong's captain was Fred Flanagan in his 8th season with Geelong. When he was interviewed about his team, he said, "There were no reputations in Geelong. A player only makes a side if he is good enough, and it was no loss of face to play in the seconds. Most important of all, we are all fighting fit. Most of the team are non-drinkers and non-smokers. The rule is no drinking from Sunday to Saturday." Collingwood's captain was Lou Richards. Famous to many for his long media career, he was a very fine footballer who was intensely passionate about the Collingwood Football Club. He also had the knack of riling up his opponents, who would then be distracted from their game while he focused on his. Lou hated losing and was a very effective goal kicker, 3 times leading the Magpie goal-kicking list. Lou's pre-game message to supporters was, "Magpies produce their best when the going is hardest." Geelong's coach was Reg Hickey, who was a disciplinarian but could connect with the players. On one of the many wet, muddy, raining training nights, Bob Davis turned up wearing gumboots, a fisherman's hat and a rubber coat. Hickey made him run up and down the ground in his gumboots wearing his hat, to everybody's enjoyment. Hickey knew when and how to push his players, and they would do anything for their coach. His pre-grand final message to the press was, "If we have 14 playing well, we will win." Collingwood's coach in this grand final was Fons Kine, in just his 3rd season after taking the coaching reins from Jock McHale, in a controversial process that split the club when one faction of the committee preferred seconds coach Mervyn Wood to replace Jock. That was a short-lived plan, and much of the committee was replaced as Kine took charge. He was respected by the playing group, many who had served under him while he was captain. He continued much of the methods of Jock McHale while adding a few touches of his own. He knew how to get his message across and did not berate players in public. If something had to be said, it was done one-on-one. The umpire was James Jamieson for his 2nd successive grand final. He had officiated in the first semi-final, yet been overlooked for the next 2 finals before being tapped on the shoulder for the big game. It was only the 2nd time in the last 10 years that 3 umpires had been used across the finals. Jamieson had played football as a youngster and was a very successful professional runner. He began his league umpiring career in 1943, and this was his 5th final and his 2nd grand final. He would retire after the 1954 season and began a regular column for the Argus called Straight Talk, providing an umpire's perspective of the game. Geelong selected an unchanged team from the 2nd semi-final, although there were 4 new faces from last year's grand final team. Jeff Williams, Doug Palmer, Norm Sharp and Sid Smith replaced Loy Stewart, who had only managed a couple of games at the start of the season, and Tom Morrow, whose injured knee ended his 120-game career after round 16, and Les Reed, who had been in and out of the team, last seen in the round 18 win against Richmond. He'd be back next season for another go. Sid Tate had retired after the 1951 plague. There was one player very lucky to be playing in the Geelong team. On the Monday before the grand final, Russell Middlemas was painting a roof with teammate Cats fullback Bruce Morrison. Middlemas slipped and badly cut his stomach. It needed 13 stitches to close the wound and more for his cut wrist. He took some painkillers, but he wasn't going to miss the grand final for something as trivial as a stitched-up stomach. He put some padding over it and played out the game. Collingwood had lost Peter Lucas to a thigh injury and Pat Toomey, who also had a torn thigh muscle, so they both suffered the pain of missing a grand final to injury. they would be both back in 1953 for another chance. Ken Aiken came into the side on the bench. He had been dropped after the semi-final, but was back for his 17th game this season. The shock selection that had everybody talking was Keith Batchelor, making his debut in a grand final, joining a very select group. Collingwood had to register him as a senior player on the Friday. Batchelor was given the ominous challenge of taking on George Gonnanon, second on the league goal-kicking list. Batchelor had started at Victoria Park in 1947, playing about 40 reserves games before moving to Carlton in June 1951. Then, after failing to get a senior game there, he returned to the Magpies halfway through 1952. Now he had his chance in the biggest game of the year, in what Hugh Buggy described as the biggest football sensation of the year. The Cats went into the game as the hottest of hot favourites. They had not lost a game since round 9. They had a team that was humming, bringing a new focus on speed and attack to VFL football. While Collingwood had been second on the ladder for much of the season, they were struggling with injuries, and had just been through a bruising encounter with Fitzroy a week earlier, and had just selected a debut player on one of the best full forwards in the league. Although Essendon had been the hottest of hot favourites in 1948, and they didn't win the premiership that year, so who knew what was going to happen? 82,890 were at the game, and better planning and coordination by MCG officials and staff meant the crowd stayed on their side of the fence this time. The city of Geelong had begun emptying out on Friday afternoon, with 40,000 estimated to be heading to Melbourne across Friday and Saturday. One keen group left Belmont on Friday evening, riding their push bikes up to Melbourne. Hotels in Melbourne were packed, and many supporters from both teams spent the night camped outside the MCG to ensure their spot on the queue. Geelong's Jeff Williams was in his debut year. He had played all but one game in his first season, but because he was working for a bank in Melbourne, he trained each week with St Kilda. It must have been odd to be playing with a team on top of the ladder, winning most weeks, but turning up to training each Tuesday and Thursday at a club that was on the bottom of the ladder, who lost almost every week. Even on grand final day, a big day for any player, let alone someone in their first season, he had to go to work on Saturday morning to the bank. They would not give him the day off. He caught the train into the head office and saw the long queues waiting to get into the MCG, and then did his shift before the bank generously let him off at 11 a.m. He went home, had something to eat, and headed back into the ground. He did not have to queue up. Lou Richards left the pub that he was running and drove to the ground with his brother Ron. He'd allowed plenty of time, aiming to arrive 30 minutes before they were needed. Sadly for Lou, he'd left his bag back at the pub. Ron headed into the ground while the Collingwood skipper drove away from the MCG at breakneck speed, heading back to North Melbourne. In Flinders Street, a policeman on a motorbike pulled him over for speeding. Lou explained who he was, where his gear was, and that he was supposed to be getting ready to lead Collingwood into the grand final. The policeman knew his responsibility in a situation like this. He told Lou to follow him. Although there was no siren or flashing lights, the police motorbike guided Lou through traffic to the pub, where his wife Edna handed over the bag, and he raced back to the MCG with the police escort. He got to the car park, and, to add insult to injury, he was directed to a parking spot the furthest away from the ground. By the time he made it into the rooms, he was a nervous wreck. Not the ideal way to prepare for the game. In his own words, he played a shocker. The Under-19 premiership had been decided at the start of September, with Essendon beating North Melbourne at Princess Park. It was the Bombers' fourth Under-19 grand final in 5 years. The curtain raiser was a reserves grand final between a Collingwood team stretched thin, providing replacements to the senior side, and Essendon in their fourth grand final in a row. The Bombers were too strong, running away with the game in the last quarter. Essendon's senior team may have missed the finals, but their junior teams were still in excellent form, perhaps providing hope for the future. Fred Flanagan won the toss, and Geelong kicked to the punt road end. The game started with a flurry of free kicks as umpire Jamieson, like he did in 1951, looked to impose his authority. 5 frees in the first 4 minutes meant a lot of whistleblowing. Collingwood was struggling with injuries from very early on. Neil Mann hurt his thigh in the first few minutes, and not long after, Captain Lou Richards was with the trainers after a knock to the head and a bleeding right arm. Despite those setbacks, it was the Magpies throwing their weight around in an attempt to unsettle the Cats. Tyrrell Merritt got the first goal of the game for Collingwood with a long drop kick. That sparked the Cats into action with a series of 4 goals. 2 to Gonanon, who was proving a handful for debutant Batchelor. In Batchelor's defence, Gonanon was getting wonderful delivery by the fast-moving Cats. Bob Davis got a free kick on the half-forward line and kicked a magnificent 60-yard drop kick, sending the ball right through the middle. A true grand final goal. Geelong went to the quarter-time break with a 3-goal lead, and many in the crowd thinking they were about to see a procession. Fons Kine once again instructed his players to tackle hard to slow down the speedy Cats. The Magpies rallied in the second quarter. Jack Parker kicked a couple of quick goals, and Collingwood's hard tackling was stopping Geelong's usual speedy system. They did not score a goal until time on, and at half-time, the hottest of hot favourites were only 2 goals in front. Collingwood supporters' hopes for a surprise boil-over were increasing. Geelong barrackers were feeling just a little bit nervous. While Reg Hickey gave the Geelong players some very direct feedback, Fons Kine and the match committee at Collingwood made some changes as the teams came out for the second half. Jack Fink went from centre-half back to full forward. Neil Mann went into the half-back position, and Harvey Stevens began to change in the ruck with Mick Toomey and rest in the forward pocket. Geelong got off to a good start when Gonanon kicked his 4th goal, despite Batchelor doing his best. The Magpies responded, getting the goal into the forward line, and Parker got another free kick and his 3rd goal, all of them from free kicks. After the bounce, it was a speedy Tyrrell Merritt racing through with his 2nd goal to reduce the gap to just 7 points halfway through the 3rd quarter. The noise from the crowd was lifting. Collingwood are carrying injuries. They were without a few of their better players, and they did not have the benefit of a week off. But their plan seemed to be working. Until it didn't. From that moment, Geelong took complete control. They'd been the best team all season, and now they played like it. 2 quick goals changed the complexion of the game. Geelong's confidence lifted, and perhaps the Magpies had just reached their limit. Geelong would kick 7 goals to none across the remainder of the game. Davis was dominating in the forward line, and Williams was almost impassable on the half-back line. Collingwood could just manage 7 behinds in the last quarter, as many in the crowd made their way out of the ground. Geelong had not lost in 13 games, and they were worthy premiers. Geelong, 13 goals 8, 86, to Collingwood, 5 goals 10, 40. This year there was a strong police cordon around the ground, so there was a smaller than usual cohort of supporters that made it onto the ground to cheer off their heroes. First-year player and regular St Kilda training attendee, Jeff Williams was declared best on ground, and he would go on to win Geelong's best and fairest in what was a very impressive debut season. 10,000 people were at the Geelong Town Hall, with the Geelong City Band providing the tunes to welcome home the all-conquering premiership team, returning at 9:20pm with their 5th VFL premiership. As the crowd appealed for various players, Bob Davis stepped forward and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, and coach." He was no gentleman at half-time. "You have given me more kicks than I got in the game today. I told you last year we would be here again, and now I say the same for next year." The next day, there were so many people at Cardinia Park, over 6,000, that the club abandoned the traditional ceremony of burying a toy magpie for fear some would be hurt in the crush of enthusiastic supporters. There was one more game of football before the focus would switch to other sports. 1 week after the grand final, Essendon and Richmond staged a demonstration night game at the showgrounds. As could be expected in this wettest of wet seasons, it was very cold, there was gale-force wind and heavy rain, and still 15,000 people turned up for a game that had no meaning, other than bringing night football to Melbourne for the second time. Way back in 1935, Richmond and South Melbourne played a pre-season game under lights at the old Olympic Park. So this was a real novelty occasion. Both teams had kept up training since the end of the season and were keen for the win. People were turning up from 5 o'clock in the afternoon for a game that kicked off at 8 p.m. Essendon were the far superior team, winning 14-9 to Richmond 2-10. The potential of night football was apparent to all. How the league would take advantage of it was yet to be defined. For Richmond, the game marked the very last match coached by Jack Dyer. He'd begun as captain coach in 1941 and non-playing coach in 1950. He had coached Richmond to 3 grand finals for 1 premiership. While he had been a great on-field leader, questions had been raised on whether he was the best option as a non-playing coach. We'll see how that unfolds in the next episode. There would not be another national day to promote the game. It took the league another 29 years before it scheduled another premiership points match in Brisbane, and 35 years before the city got its own team. The next push for a national code, with games in Brisbane and Sydney, and then a team moving to Sydney, was led by Alan Aylett, who spent his national day playing in Albury as an 18-year-old. The pioneers of that 1952 night game in Brisbane would have been amazed to see the league play a grand final in Brisbane in 2020, with COVID changing all the rules. The truly national competition providing venues outside of the traditional footy states. The efforts of 1952 may have been a once-off, but it was a window into the future. Join us next time as we focus on 1953, when Geelong does what no other team has ever been able to match. If you've enjoyed Grand Final history, please leave a review wherever you get your podcast from. The more goals we kick, the easier it is for others to find the podcast. If you have questions or want to leave feedback, please email me at info@grandfinalhistory.au or check out the grandfinalhistory.au website or Facebook or Blue Sky for more Grand Final history.